There is a country where two bloodlines live inside the same body and refuse to agree on where home is. Trace the line that runs through the mothers, generation after generation, and you arrive at one history. Trace the line that runs through the fathers, and you arrive at another. Same villages, same households, same surnames carried at the same dinner tables for centuries. And yet the maternal thread and the paternal thread, when scientists finally separated them, told two stories so different that for years no one was certain which one was lying. This isn't a metaphor. It is measured, sequenced, published. A gap between a mother's ancestry and a father's ancestry wider than almost anything recorded in human population genetics. People here describe themselves with a single word: a nationality, a regional identity, a language spoken at home. The body keeps two separate ledgers underneath that word, and the ledgers don't reconcile. Somewhere inside that gap is the truth of who this nation actually is. Which line is lying about where it came from? The story most people are taught starts deep, in the late Stone Age, with a population North Africans have long called indigenous, the Amazigh, more widely known by the name outsiders gave them, Berber. Before Carthage, before Rome, before Islam ever crossed the strait, there were already people living along these mountains and coastlines, speaking languages that belonged to no outside empire. Then came the layers, roughly in the order the textbooks give them. Phoenician traders arrived to build coastal outposts. Rome arrived to build provinces and roads and forts. Vandal armies arrived briefly, then Byzantine administrators arrived behind them. And in the late 7th century, Arab armies arrived carrying a language, a faith, and a new political order that would eventually reshape how millions of people described themselves. The mountains kept one language, held on. The cities adopted another, moved on. The identity split along that line and never fully closed it again. This is not a strawman version of the story. It is, broadly, the accepted one, and it shows up today in real cultural geography. In Kabylie, in the Ores Mountains, in the Maghreb Valley, Berber-speaking communities are treated as living relics of the population that was there first, holding on to something the rest of the country supposedly diluted. The rest of the nation, in this telling, simply added layers on top of the same foundational people, Arabized in language but genealogically continuous, still standing on the same indigenous bedrock underneath. Later still, the same coastline absorbed Ottoman administration, then French colonial rule, each one leaving its own mark on language and law without, in the standard telling, ever touching the deeper genetic foundation underneath. It is a tidy story. Stone Age roots, conquest after conquest, settling on top like sediment in a riverbed, and a present-day population that is simply that sediment, layered, complete. But genetics doesn't read a population by language or by region. It reads a population by line, the line carried only through mothers and the line carried only through fathers. And when researchers actually split this country open along those two threads instead of along Arab and Berber, the tidy sediment story stops settling the way it should. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2013, a team from the University of Oran, working with researchers at the University of La Laguna in Spain, did something simple but radical. They stopped looking at language and self-identification and instead sequenced two separate genetic threads in 240 unrelated Algerians from the northwest of the country, a sample large enough and broad enough to stand in for the wider population rather than a single town or family network. The first thread was mitochondrial DNA, genetic material passed only from mother to child, untouched by any father's contribution, generation after generation. Think of it as a sealed letter, copied by hand from mother to daughter for thousands of years, never co-written, never edited by anyone outside that single maternal line. The second thread was the Y chromosome, the male equivalent of that same sealed letter, passed only from father to son. A haplogroup in either case is simply a family branch within that letter's long copying history, a surname carried down not on paper but inside the body itself. When the team measured how much of each thread traced to outside Eurasian origins versus how much was specifically native to North Africa, the numbers didn't just differ. They diverged dramatically. On the maternal side, roughly 80% of the genetic signal traced to outside Eurasian-derived lineages, while the specifically North African maternal branches, the ones researchers label U6 and M1, made up only about 20% of the picture. On the paternal side, the outside Eurasian signal was even higher, near 90% overall. But narrow the lens to the North African-specific paternal lineage alone, mainly one called E-M81, and that homegrown signal held at roughly 70%, more than 3 times the comparable maternal figure. Backwards, that's the only honest word for it. Most invasion narratives, the kind taught in the conventional history above, predict the opposite pattern. Outside soldiers, traders, and settlers are usually remembered as men arriving into a population, not women. If that were the whole story here, the paternal line should carry more outside signal than the maternal line, not less. Instead, the line that should be most heavily diluted by outsiders is the one that looks most native, and the line that should be the most protected, the most indigenous, is the one carrying the deepest outside signal. A statistic like this doesn't stay quiet for long once it's published. It forces every clean version of the national origin story to answer a question it was never built to answer. The first theory is the most straightforward, and it leans on social structure rather than mystery. Across much of the Mediterranean and North Africa, societies have long been patrilocal, wives moving into their husbands' communities at marriage, while sons and their paternal lines stayed rooted in the same villages for generations, sometimes the same houses, for longer than any single empire lasted. Layer that pattern on top of a well-documented historical timeline: Phoenician outposts, Roman provincial settlement, and especially the Arab conquest beginning around 700 CE, one of the better documented demographic events in North African history. And you have outside men arriving repeatedly over roughly 1,300 years, marrying into local communities and gradually shifting the genetic picture. It's a real mechanism, the kind historians can point to with dates and decrees and tax records. Researchers are careful to frame it as a contributing factor, not a single complete answer, and multiple studies do find clear West Asian genetic contributions tied to exactly this historical window. On its own terms, it explains plenty: why outside signal exists in this population at all, why that signal has a documented historical source, why the timeline lines up with events that show up in written records as well as in DNA. What it does not explain is the direction of the imbalance. If outside men were the primary engine of change here, the paternal line should be the one absorbing that outside signal fastest, not the maternal line. Instead, the father's line in Algeria looks more rooted, not less. It's the right history, landing on the wrong side of the body. This is the part the records don't explain. And it's where the second theory comes in, reaching back far further than any conquest, far further than any written record at all. In 2012, a research team published findings in the journal PLOS Genetics proposing something larger: a single ancient migration of Eurasian people back into North Africa sometime around 12,000 years ago, tied to the late Stone Age population archaeologists call the Ibero-Maurusian culture. If that ancient pulse is the real source of the outside-looking maternal lineages, then that signal isn't recent at all. It isn't the residue of Rome or Carthage or 7th century armies. It's ancient, deeply layered, and just as indigenized to North Africa by now as anything else in the region, even if its deepest roots trace back across the strait. This theory carries real weight. 12,000 years is long enough for a population to fully absorb a genetic signal and call it native, long enough that the label outside stops meaning very much at all. Researchers studying this back migration are careful to frame it as probability, not certainty, but the dating itself has held up across multiple independent analyses. But push the timeline a little further, and it stops holding. If the maternal Eurasian signal really is that ancient, a 12,000-year-old layer, fully settled into the population, then the paternal line should show comparable depth, comparable age. An ancient single pulse should leave ancient signatures on both threads, not just one. But when researchers eventually dated the dominant paternal lineage itself, the same E-M81 branch carrying most of that homegrown-looking signal, the age that came back was nowhere close to 12,000 years, not by millennia, not even close. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud without heavy qualification, goes further still. In 2018, scientists analyzing ancient genomes from Tafaralt Cave in Morocco, individuals who lived roughly 15,000 years ago, well before any of the conquests in the textbook story in one of the oldest burial sites in North Africa to ever yield usable DNA, found that those late Stone Age North Africans carried a different paternal lineage altogether, a branch related to E-M78, not the E-M81 branch that dominates the region's male line today. That gap matters more than it sounds. It means the population living in the Maghreb 15,000 years ago and the population living there now may not be connected by an unbroken paternal thread at all. Something happened in between, and the evidence for a clean, continuous line from one to the other is thinner than most people assume. Researchers stop well short of calling this a population replacement. The data doesn't confirm a turnover, it only fails to rule one out. No one is claiming the ancient Tafaralt people vanished without descendants, and the methods involved, ancient DNA preservation, small sample sizes, the difficulty of dating deep branches precisely leave real room for a less dramatic explanation. But the question sits there anyway, unresolved, refusing to close. If today's dominant paternal lineage isn't a direct continuation of the region's oldest known population, then what is it, and where did it actually come from? Imagine standing on the harbor stones of Oran, sometime in the centuries when no single empire fully controlled this coastline. The afternoon is hot and dry, the kind of heat that presses salt air against the skin instead of carrying it away. Ships from at least 3 different trading networks sit at anchor, their hulls patched in different styles, their crews speaking in overlapping tongues that don't bother translating for each other. Gulls work the shoreline for scraps thrown from a fishmonger's table. Somewhere behind you, a spice stall releases the sharp smell of cumin and saffron into air that already smells like brine and tar. A woman calls out prices in a Berber dialect. A merchant answers her in a Latin-derived trade tongue. 2 men a few stalls down argue, lightly, in early Arabic, while a call to prayer drifts faintly over all of it, layered rather than replacing what came before. No one in this market is thinking about haplogroups or mitochondrial lineages. They are thinking about the price of grain, the tide, the heat, whether the ship in the harbor brought cloth or trouble. And yet every transaction here, every marriage that follows a friendship struck up over a spice stall, every child born 9 months after a sailor's season in port is quietly writing the genetic record researchers would spend the next 15 centuries trying to read backward. The mother's line and the father's line were both being written in this exact market at the exact same moment by the exact same population. They simply weren't being written the same way. And here the story stops being simple. In 2017, a team using full Y chromosome sequencing, not just a handful of markers, but the entire chromosome, went back to date that dominant paternal lineage E-M81 as precisely as the technology allowed. The branch most associated with deep, unbroken indigenous Berber ancestry, the lineage held up again and again as proof that something ancient survived every conquest intact, turned out to have a most recent common ancestor, the single shared root every branch on that family tree traces back to, only around 2,000 to 3,000 years old, not by millennia, by centuries. 2,000 to 3,000 years places the explosive expansion of this supposedly ancient lineage at almost exactly the same window as Carthage's dominance over the Western Mediterranean, and not long before Rome's arrival in North Africa at all. Put another way, the lineage now treated as proof of pre-conquest purity was itself spreading rapidly through the male population at almost the same moment conquest began. The lineage everyone points to as proof of purity, as evidence of a population that resisted outside influence, was itself in the middle of a rapid, recent expansion at nearly the same historical moment outsiders were arriving. The symbol of continuity and the symbol of disruption turn out to be nearly the same age. One researcher working on Algerian population genetics has put it more plainly in conversation than any paper usually allows, that the line people point to as the deepest root in the ground is, by the chromosome's own clock, one of the most recent branches on the tree. Not a fabrication, not an error, just a correction the body had been carrying quietly the entire time, waiting for the right instrument to read it. The settled story said, ancient roots, then layers added carefully on top, sediment settling in order. The chromosome says something else. It says the bottom layer everyone assumed was oldest may have been laid down last, not in the Stone Age, not even close to it, but somewhere around the time the rest of the Mediterranean was busy being conquered too. Whatever identity gets built on top of that lineage from here on has to be built, knowing that. This pattern doesn't stop at one coastline. Other populations, once their genomes get dated precisely enough, keep showing the same kind of reversal. In Europe, in the Americas, in the Pacific, the same surprise turns up under different names. A lineage gets treated as proof of ancient continuity, recently. A marker gets taught as deep, untouched heritage, recently. A bloodline gets held up as the one thing outsiders never reached, recently. Identity built on the idea of an unbroken, unchanged line rarely survives a close enough reading of the body that carries it. Not in North Africa, not anywhere humans have gone looking. A riverbed doesn't lay its sediment down in the neat order a textbook diagram suggests. Floods move layers out of place. Old channels get buried under new ones, and new channels sometimes cut down deep enough to expose something far older than what sits just above it. Stand on the bank long enough and you stop being able to tell just by looking which layer came first. The Algerians were never quite who we thought. The DNA didn't finish revealing the truth. It only proved there's more of it still buried, somewhere lower in the same riverbed, waiting on the next flood to expose it.